Uhuru, comrades, and welcome to today's Omali's Taught Me Sunday Study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Akile Anai, Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC for this morning. These studies are so important, and we encourage you right now to invite your friends and family to it. This week, Chairman Omali Yeshitela continues reading from Vanguard, the advanced attachment of the African Revolution, the political report to the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. We'll be starting with Chapter 10, The Question of the Nation, on pages 321 to 369. Following this study, we will open it up for our live viewers to ask questions. It is my honor now to introduce our leadership, the leader of the African nation and the worldwide African Revolution, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Uhuru, Chairman.
Uhuru, I want to thank you, Comrade Director Akile, for the introduction and for the incredible work that you do as the Director of Agitation and Propaganda for our party. I also want to express appreciation to party members, Uhuru forces, and others who come to this study, who've come to this particular study. You've already indicated that we'll be looking at Chapter 10 from Vanguard, which is the political report to our 7th Congress. Prior to this, of course, we had taken the same chapter, The Question of the Nation is what we'll be discussing, and that was a part of the political report to the 6th Congress. We thought it was so important that we would include it in this Vanguard, the 7th Congress political report as well. And some people, comrades, sisters and brothers, some of you perhaps may be wondering why we continue to spend so much time looking at the political report from our Congress and our Congresses. Well, the fact is that the political report is that which helps to inform what it is that we are about, what it is that we're doing at this moment, what's the basis of the work. It's one that's been adopted by the African People's Socialist Party at our Congress. This was one of the most democratic aspects of the work of our organization as we come together in these Congresses, and then the members of the party get an opportunity to vote on our assessment of reality, the determination where we are going, to challenge, if so desired, the trajectory that the leadership of the party attempts to establish for our party and for our revolution. This is an extraordinarily democratic process. And the democracy in the African People's Socialist Party in the world really requires some information, knowledge. And so it's an ongoing process of discussion so that the membership of a party in the Uhuru movement can participate in our work and charting the course of our movement, of our revolution, checking up on me and the other leaders of the party based on what it is that we've collectively determined that we're going to do. And so it's important for us to continue to look at this over and over. Secondly, this is one of the most important times that we could have chosen to look at the questions of theory, the question of philosophy, ideology, etc. This is always important, but at moments when you see high tides of resistance, struggles, and what have you, it is critical for the revolutionary organization, Revolutionary Party, the advanced attachment, to provide some kind of leadership, to take and intervene in the mass struggles of the people, to take science into these struggles. And it's important also because this is such a time where people are really open to new ideas. And we've seen in this country over the last few months, millions of people who've been thrust into political life, some for the first time in their lives, some who never thought they'd be participating in demonstrations and protests or anything to that effect. And some who have lamented the fact that they were not around during high tides of struggle and resistance that they've read about in the past. We've got these people who enthusiastically were pushed in, who leaped into struggle. And as a consequence of that, of course, this is a process where, you know, we engage in trying to change the world, change what's going on, and we become changed ourselves. And we initially, many of us are mobilized with deep, profound emotions. And that becomes a driving force, a driving factor of our involvement. We are fed up. We don't like what we see. We are appalled at how the system affects Africans and other peoples in the world. And we want to do something, anything. We get out the house, make a sign, join a protest, pick up a brick, do something. This is what we see happening so often. And almost every instance has happened. New blood comes being injected into resistance, into struggle, making some of the same mistakes that have been made before. And of course, being veterans of the movement, being a part of an historical continuum gives us the ability to provide leadership in this process. And now many people, as the struggle in some instances maybe subsiding or becoming normalized, as I say, protests subsiding and perhaps becoming normalized, then people are faced with, okay, what's it for? People really have to ask the question, okay, they've seen and participated in demonstrations, they faced cops, tear gas, rubber bullets, the arsenal of the oppressor, and they've pushed the state and its servile media to acknowledge the crimes that the U.S. has committed on certain levels against African people. And then people are having to assess, okay, I've demonstrated, I've thrown the brick, and then where are we going? This ultimately, this inevitably emerges. For some people, of course, it doesn't matter because they simply want to get it out of the system. They've done their protests, et cetera, but others will be taken to a much higher level of struggle or resistance, or at least their desire to go beyond mere protest, occupation of an office or what have you. And so they look for answers. And it is our responsibility as members of the party and the Uhuru movement, obviously, to try to provide these answers. The question, to what end? And this ultimately is a very important question because people will go to prison. And as in the past, there are people who from the Black Liberation Movement of the 60s who've been locked up for 50 years or more as we have this discussion. And they have to be faced all the time with the question of to what end? You know, I engaged in this protest, I engaged in this demonstration, I've done this and that, and here I am, and now having to say, what was it for? And it's our responsibility as the advanced detachment, as revolutionaries, to have a really scientific assessment of what it is that we're fighting for all the time. And to the extent it's possible, we find creative ways to take this understanding to the masses of people. That's what we call mass political education. We try to provide that for masses of people. Our slogans, we've tried to do that with our propaganda that we trained all the time training to be able to take out into the world, the flyers that we distribute, the stuff that we put up on social media. All of that is our attempts to give some coherence and some meaning, some science to a revolutionary project. And right now, it's really important for us to do that. Now, we are African internationalists, which means that simply that we are an organization whose practice is informed by a philosophy. We have a world view. And this is something that sometimes in the height of struggle, we find that people are resistant to, don't want to deal with philosophy, don't want to deal with theory, et cetera. You know, we know they did it. Let's go get them, let's do something, et cetera, et cetera. And there's another aspect of it is that because the philosophy and theory they've generally been in the custody of an elite sector of our population, these forces in our community who have been produced by the universities and they call themselves and are really recognized essentially as as sort of intellectuals, and they don't recognize it most of the time, but they're petty bourgeois intellectuals. And what we find, and I find frequently, is that we have people who are in motion now, and some of them are just outright rank opportunists who would misdirect and mislead the masses of the people and build themselves, as opposed to building a genuine revolutionary project. And they are pop philosophers. They are what we might call trending philosophers. Whatever is trending at the moment, they attach it to themselves and their definition of what they're about. And so they are against imperialism, and they're against capitalism, and they're against racism, and they're against colonialism, and they're against patriarchy, and they're against all these other things. There is no coherent philosophical direction. And that's what our responsibility is, to provide that. And it's not to provide it to correct these guys, because the persons who I'm talking about are fraudulent anyway. They are forces who are opportunists who would try to get in front of a revolutionary project and misdirect it, and keep the African working class from being able to discover its direction and discover its own self-serving cause. So we go through this work of trying to bring science and bring revolutionary history to the African working class in particular. And of course, as you know, we go into circles that are not simply dominated by the African working class. I spoke before at Oxford a year or so ago, what the premier academy of the bourgeoisie in the whole world. Oxford is the leading bourgeois university in the world. And obviously that is not a place that is haunted by the African working class. The African working class does not reside there. But we went there nevertheless because we knew of its reach, because the fact of the matter is that most of the philosophy that the African working class, the poor peasants, the oppressed peoples of the world get eventually is philosophy that comes from academies like Oxford. That is, we might get it second, third hand and what have you, but Oxford trains those who train us, who take information out. And we knew that we had a great reach by going there. And so we went there, and although the audience that we spoke to was an audience primarily, with the exception of the forces that came because we were there, were primarily servants of the bourgeoisie. They were bourgeoisie in the making. They were bourgeoisie in training and what have you, or their servants. We went there because we knew, as a consequence of going there, that our audience, our reach would extend to the smallest village on the continent of Africa, or to the neighborhood in the colonial community of Houston, Texas. We knew that we'd be speaking to a much larger audience because the reach of the bourgeoisie, because that's who pumps information into our brains all the time anyway. So we wanted in on that. We took advantage of that. So now, and that, by the way, is a presentation which was 10 minutes long, that's been seen by 3 or 4 million people at least since it was made a little more than a year ago. And so it's an ongoing struggle for us. We have a responsibility to become working class intellectuals. We're not intellectual of the bourgeoisie. And this is one of the things that was startling for many of the people at Oxford, because they heard from a working class intellectual. We broke all the rules of decorum and other things regarding how one is supposed to present at Oxford. And we spoke, we went for the jugular vein of the bourgeoisie, its perception of the world, its perception of Africa and African people. And that's what we're doing now. So we're going through this study. We're going to talk about it. I'm going to try, and it may take 2 or 3 sessions to get through this. And because I really want us to take the time to look at what we're talking about, to really think about it, to let things marinate and go out into the world being informed about this. And we can test, we can in practice test the theoretical assumptions that are found in this text. Today, we want to talk about the nation. And some people may assume you know everything you need to know about the nation, but generally speaking, that's not true. And it's not because you're not smart, but it's an issue that's muddled all the time. And the rulers of this country and of the world, they intentionally muddle this question of nations. And just a slight familiarity with recent history, the history of the last couple of hundred years, 200 or 300 years, can see why. Because the definition of different groups who have been characterized as nations have changed so many times. And we want to talk about the nation because the bourgeoisie is concerned about this question, as we will see when we open up with this, that the question of the nation is not just some abstract thing. You just can't say that we are new Africans, or we are African-American descendants of slaves, or we are the huge different kinds of characterizations that we give, that we find ourselves affiliated with, where we find attached to us. The national question, this question of nation, is so critical. It's the only way, dealing with it is the only way that we can get around the issues of the ethnic violence that we find ourselves confronted with in various parts of the world, and particularly in Africa, but not exclusively in Africa, where there's been a retardation of the development of our societies created by the borders and colonialism that's imposed its will on African people and limited our or misdirected the development of our nation and our society. So as I mentioned, and as will be revealed from the very first paragraph of this discussion, this chapter, this issue of identity, nation, is something that the bourgeoisie takes very seriously as well. And so it's our responsibility to take control of this question, to give it the kinds of attention that it needs to be given, to contribute a scientific approach to the question, so that it's not just something that we do to satisfy some whim, to say that, well, that we're Blacker than somebody else, but there is a scientific basis for that, and this recognition of the science and being propelled by the requirements of national liberation and consolidation, being compelled to understand this for our own liberation. We give as much attention to this as possible. This is something that we need to look at, and we study in the process of making struggle. Study, we don't just study, but study is meaningless if we're not engaged in practice, because that's the only way our study is validated. It gives this the process through which we rectify any errors in our studies, any errors that we may be making. It's through actual practice. Practice is primary, and it's from this practice that we either prove valid what it is that we have assumed about the world, or we prove it invalid, which is also helpful in that it gives us an opportunity to be set on the right path. So we're going now to chapter 10, the question of the nation, which starts on 321 in Vanguard. And there's an introduction here about the question of the nation, but I'm going to pass over the italicized introduction and go straight into the chapter. And this is where we see that this question of the nation is something that the bourgeoisie is thinking representatives. It's forward-looking representatives. As I say, this ruling class, there are forces that thinks for it, that studies for it, that provides some kind of scientific explanation for this reality and direction. So, and we start off talking about this, opening up with this statement from that shows how the bourgeoisie, through its thinking representatives, through those forces that again come up with ideas and present them to the bourgeoisie to say, this is the reality, this is how we have to sum up things and move forward. Let's see what its thinking representatives, how it has become increasingly necessary for us to deal with the issue of the nation. So we start off on page 321. And here it says that imperialist political oracle and Obama advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski is a ruling class observer of the crisis of imperialism. And Brzezinski has been writing about this crisis almost as long as we have. He's seen the developing world, how things are unfolding. And this is not some leftist, by the way. And this is not just an advisor, was not just an advisor to Obama. He's had his fingers in a lot, having to give direction to how imperialism, how the US imperialist forces would act in the world to defend and advance his own interests. So imperialist political oracle and Obama advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski is a ruling class observer of the crisis of imperialism. In his book, Second Chance, 3 Presidents and the Crisis of a Superpower, Brzezinski makes this observation about the significance of the question of identity today, when imperialism is being challenged to its parasitic foundation by the political intervention of the peoples upon whose oppression this system was founded. Now, Brzezinski's book, we'll see, this political report, this issue of the nation was something that we discussed, I think in 2000, would it have been 2018? It would have been in the political report to the 6th Congress. So here's Brzezinski. Global systemic instability is likely to be prompted in many parts of the world by challenges to existing state frontiers. In Asia and Africa especially, state borders are often imperial legacies and do not reflect ethnic or linguistic boundaries. These borders are vulnerable to increased pressure as heightened political consciousness leads to more assertive territorial aspirations. The largely anti-Western character of populist activism has less to do with ideological or religious bias and more with historical experience. Western or European domination is part of the living memory of hundreds of millions of Asians and Africans, and some Latin Americans, though in this case, its sharp edge is pointed at the United States. In the vast majority of states, national identity and national emancipation are associated with the end of foreign imperial domination. This is true in such large and self-confident states as India or China, as it is in Congo or Haiti. So he's saying national identity in the vast majority of states, national identity and national emancipation are associated with the end of foreign imperial domination. Just the end of the quote by Brzezinski. And then we go, in addition to Brzezinski's consideration of the question, there is a bevy of other publications attempting to address the same issues of the nation and identity. They include David Canadine's 2013 book, The Undivided Past, Humanity Beyond Our Differences, and the 2004 Samuel Huntington book titled, Who Are We? The Challenges to America's National Identity. So we can see this is something that the bourgeoisie is talking about, the thinking representatives are talking about. These are erudite intellectuals whose mission it is to hold these discussions, to inform the bourgeoisie, to inform the rulers about the world and how to understand things. Patrick Buchanan's Suicide of a Superpower, Will America Survive to 2025, is another of the intellectual forays into the arena of the nation and its future from the vantage point of various representatives of US and or European imperialism. These far-seeking thinking representatives of the white ruling class are being forced to contend with the earth-shattering consequences of a European civilization resting on the historical fault line of economic parasitism. the shifting center of gravity in the world, the omnipresent upsurge of the wretched of the earth, to realize our dreams of happiness and security come at the expense of imperialist stability. The resistance of the oppressed unhinges the previous definitions of social reality that require imperialist imposed tranquility for its foundation and raises the question of the nation and identity to center stage. In his 2007 book, Day of Reckoning, How Hubris, Ideology, and Greed Are Tearing America Apart, Patrick Buchanan probes the question of the nation. Quoting Buchanan, Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, it is said, were artificial nations created by the treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain in 1919. And this is the end of the first imperialist world war, where these treaties reconfigured much of Europe and what were now to be considered European nations, European countries, and what have you. This is also the thing that helped thrust Garvey, Marcus Garvey, forward as part of this configuration. During this process, they have created the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations, and they were talking about who was going to control what parts of Africa during this discussion. And it was Garvey who said Africa for Africans at home and abroad. So Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, it is said, were artificial nations created by the treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain in 1919. And the Soviet Union was but the Russian Empire reconstituted by the Red Army, the KGB, which was the Soviet intelligence organization, the Communist Party, and Leninist ideology, not a nation at all. This sudden disintegration of these three nations into 26 seems to substantiate Strobe Talbot's prediction in his 1992 Times essay, The Birth of the Global Nation. And this is what he's quoting Talbot now. All countries are basically social arrangements, accommodations to changing circumstances, no matter how permanent and even sacred they may seem at any one time. In fact, they are all artificial and temporary. Within the next 100 years, nationhood as we know it will be obsolete. All states will recognize a single global authority. A phrase briefly fashionable in the mid-20th century, citizen of the world, would have assumed real meaning by the end of the 21st century. This is the end of the quote that he's within his quote. Is the time of nations over? Is the nation state passing away? Are the bonds that hold them together so flimsy? Since Talbot's essay, events have not contradicted him, unquote. Buchanan's summation is representative of the anxiety of the international white ruling class, whose concerns about defending their world hegemony are reflected in the drone bombings, assassinations, unrelenting war, and threats of war. The current policies of the imperialists designed to crush the will of the people's resistance in Afghanistan and the Middle East, all of Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the world are attempts to maintain the shaky empire and its ideological reflection that define identity and the nation according to its interests and will. Our entry into this discussion of the nation is mandated by the seriousness of the time. It is mandated by the requirement of Africans and the oppressed to provide a summation of reality that reflects our interests and our aspirations. Our summation is based on science and objective analysis grounded in material reality that predicts the defeat of imperialism and the emancipation of the toiling masses of Africa and the world. Our discussion of the nation is informed by our inevitable elevation as workers to the role of the ruling class in the transition to a world shorn of classes, borders, nations, and states. To win our liberation, we must know who we are and who our enemies are. Let us begin. Most often the question of African nationality is handled
in careless, offhanded, and vague ways, making no pretense of ascribing to any particular scientific approach or definition. The common practice among Pan-Africanists of referring to the international African community as African peoples is an example. More commonly, there is the practice of characterizing Africans forcibly dispersed from the continent more commonly, there is the practice of characterizing Africans forcibly dispersed from the continent as African descendants, with the intent of differentiating the national identity of such Africans from those who suffered imperial white domination on the continent itself. So the rest of us are descendants, African descendants, and even the United Nations uses this term. Africans are not unusual in the ambiguous manner in which the question of the nation is handled. In the past few centuries, there has been much debate concerning this issue among some of Europe's most erudite intellectuals. Their approach is equivalent to the quote, "I don't know anything about art, but I know what I like." And this is a discussion for the past 2 centuries that's happened without the active participation of Africans. Generally speaking, we were living under colonial dominations. And here's the colonizer, here's the imperialists. Here are the imperialists who control the entire world and are now defining the world according to their interests and their aspirations. Similarly, it is difficult to get a uniform definition of the nation from different scholars or intellectuals. Some claim outright that there is not an a priori definition of the nation. I can't tell you what it is, they might say, but I know it when I see it. What is probably the most influential definition of the nation is one offered by Joseph Stalin. This is because as leader of the Soviet Union and the international communist movement from 1924 to 1953, Stalin took the question out of the classrooms and into the fray of political movements throughout the world. Stalin applied his interpretation to the real conditions impacting and tormenting millions of people struggling to define their places in the world. Written in the end of 1912 or early 1913, Stalin's position, later published in pamphlet form, defined the nation's key elements, which according to Stalin included a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. Let me read that again. This is Stalin's definition, and this has been most influential, especially among people who consider themselves progressive, revolutionary, communist, and what have you. Stalin's, according to Stalin, the key elements of the nation included a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. Already that lets us out in terms of a stable community of people. Obviously, the situation of Africans does not satisfy Stalin's definition of the nation, whether applied to the artificially created African so-called countries carved out at the imperialist Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, or to African people forcibly dispersed around the world. While Stalin's question of the nation is one of many, it contains within it elements being offered by others at the time and even today. In fact, Stalin's definition was a struggle against contending definitions forwarded by European socialists at a time when nationalist sentiments were roiling in Europe. These ideas would soon facilitate the European bourgeois war to redivide the world, the first imperialist world war or World War I. In his book, The Undivided Past, referred to above, author David Cannadine challenges many of the prevalent ideas around which the definition of the nation revolves. Here he deals with the requirement that makes language a prerequisite. While not addressing Stalin specifically, Cannadine has this to say about the self-defined European nations involved in the First Imperialist World War. So we're looking at what Canadan is saying, and this is what we're going through now is just definitions and struggles that Europeans were having among themselves around the question of the nation. These are defining discussions, defining struggles, because most of us have been pushed out of the discussion. They don't even mention Africa and African people. And most of the oppressed peoples of the world are not a part of this discussion. This is Europe. This is the imperialist. This is the colonizer engaged in this discussion, or essentially the colonizer. This is the colonizer and other Europeans debating about this question. So we go, here's what Canadan had to say about the self-defined nations involved in the First Imperialist World War. To begin with, the idea, quote, that the belligerents of 1914 were unified, homogeneous nations does not survive detailed examination. Consider, for example, the matter of common language, often regarded as essential to any shared sense of national identity. And this is important to us because this is something that people who attack Africa and African people can't be a nation because of the absence of what they call a common language. And that's another discussion for another time. We can deal with that. We can shatter that lie. But it certainly did not exist in the nation created by the Risorgimento. And we have made Italy, Massimo D'Azeglio observed at the time. Now we have to make Italians. With less than 5% of the population using Italian for everyday purposes, they had a long way to go. In France, almost half the school children engaged with French as a foreign language, speaking another tongue at home. Dialect and patois were widespread. And in departments bordering other nations, it was often Flemish, Catalan, or German that was spoken. A similar picture could also be found in Germany, where in the East, many spoke Polish as their first language. Whereas in Alsace and Lorraine, many spoke French. And in Russia, educated people conversed in French, while workers and peasants used a wide variety of Slavic languages and dialects. In Austria-Hungary, the array of different tongues was even more varied, including German, Czech, Italian, Hungarian, Polish, Croatian, and Greek. And many of the Habsburg's emperor's subjects were multilingual, speaking one language at school or at work and another at home. Insofar as a common tongue could be considered an essential criterion, none of the major powers that went to war in 1914 qualified as a nation. So, and this is just useful, as Europeans discuss this issue of nation, and as many of us have been trapped by this idea that you can't be a nation if there are a variety of languages being spoken. Of course, we don't agree that all of these different entities that's described here are nations anyway, but that's another story that we'll get to as we move forward. So Canadan challenges other ideas generally used to determine the nation, some of which also disputes Stalin's definition, influential definition. We know many of the limitations of Stalin's work from our own observations. However, this does not relieve us of the need to enter into this discussion. It is true that nations exist, if only because the nation is a commonly held idea along the lines of Marx's maxim that theory, when grasped by the masses, becomes a material force. Indeed, the idea of the nation is something that has been grasped by the masses, to the extent that people actually kill and die in the name of furthering its perceived interests. Slavery, colonialism, basis of the European nation. One of the least discussed questions concerning the nation is the basis for its advent in history. How is it that the world is perceived as a place where for thousands of years there was no such thing as the nation, only to have it suddenly emerge in Europe? dominating the 19th century, often referred to as the era of nation building. Yeah. Yeah, it's almost hysterical because the era of nation building that we're talking about is definitely a discussion about Europe, because the era of nation building was also an era when Europe was in the process of building, consolidating itself through horrible aggressions against peoples all around the world, from the Middle East to Africa, to all this time period that Marx referred to as primitive accumulation of capital, Asia, throughout the Americas. This is what you're seeing during this period of time in the 19th century, this the rise of what some would characterize as imperialism as well. This is the period of nation building. One attempt at an explanation for the advent. So we're saying, why does the nation come about? What was it? What is the material basis then for the rise of this thing they call a nation? And one attempt at an explanation for the advent of the European nation is provided by Modibo M. Kadali, PhD, in his book published in 2000 titled Internationalism, Pan-Africanism, and the Struggle of Social Classes. This rather lengthy and vacuous quote illustrates the general lack of clarity that surrounds the issue. And I'm going to quote Modibo here. After thousands of years of change, transformation, setbacks, rapid advances, monstrous defeats, unevenness, and human conflicts with nature and with other human beings, which was constantly changing in its character, the colossal units of production and exchange that have come to be known as the modern nation state came into being, ruled and fashioned by a class of people who resulted from this long and arduous path of dialectical development. The modern nation state was the creation of the modern bourgeoisie and serves as the political form or funnel through which this class continues to perpetuate itself in its quest for historical immortality. The most highly developed political formations of this type took place in Europe and later in North America. It is for those reasons that the brutality has come to be part of this class slashing its way across the planet has come to be associated with Europeans generally. Rightfully so, capitalism and the European predatory nation state became to Europe and the rest of the world what feudalism in its most advanced forms was in Asia, and communal and intricate pre-feudal modes along with a variety of early forms of social production were to the continent of Africa. The European bourgeoisie could become international precisely because they were national. After carving out and consolidating their sway within a certain geographical area, which defined its boundaries, a given national state could continue its expansion. This occurs because of the organic and predatory nature of the capitalist mode of production. With this expansion, bourgeois rule spreads. It therefore becomes a highly developed system for international conquest with its ruling class at the helm, guiding in a deliberate and calculating way its own realization and affirmation through continuous conquest. That's a long, rather interesting, and there's a term in logic that, in philosophy, that defines how, Modibo's presentation reads. What Kadali has done here is to detail the obvious. Indeed, the modern nation state was the creation of the modern bourgeoisie. And indeed, it is predatory. However, after all is said and done, we still do not know its origin, nor the historical basis for its emergence in Europe. In addition, we are misinformed by Kadali, who claims, quote, the European bourgeoisie could become international precisely because they were national. In fact, the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois nation were products of imperialism, the international activities of slavery and colonialism. Imperialism, we're saying that the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois nation were products of imperialism, the international activity of slavery and colonialism. And that's what we say, how this thing that they're defining as the nation emerges. They talk about in the 19th century, at the same time we look at what's characterized as the advent of imperialist expansion, imperialist development in the world, the attack on Africa and all these other places. So you see a dialectic there, that one thing being born at the expense of the other. This is the process. This is the relationship that we're looking at. So here is the point made by Jose Jaffe in his book, A History of Africa. I'm on 329, and I'm quoting Jaffe now. It's an interesting quote. The 15th century then saw the multiplication of the primary accumulation of European capitalism. And Africa played the most important part in the process as the principal arena of European colonialism, the very genesis and foundation of the capitalist system. From the turn of the 16th century, the Americas and Asia were added to this foundation. And out of this totality arose capitalism and modern Europe itself. Before capitalist colonialism, there was no Europe, only a collection of feudal, mercantile, and tribal towns, farms, villages, discrete states, and kingdoms vying and warring with each other, just as in Africa, but on a different property basis, that of private property in the land. Europe then was neither a concept nor a reality, at most a vague idea that Arabs, but not quote unquote Europeans, had long ago of someplace northwest of Greece. As long as Europe remained isolated from the world, there was no Europe. When it became connected with and dependent on first Africa, then the Americas, and finally Asia, it began to become a reality and an idea. Only when Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, Dutch, English, German, Danish, and Swedish confronted and clashed with Africa, America, and Asia did the need arise for them to consider themselves as a set, a whole, different from, hostile to, and eventually superior to Africans, Americans, and Asians. Colonialism gave them a common interest. So Jaffe is making the point that Europe was characterized by just warring tribes fighting against each other, engaged in brigandage and the rest of it, internal and internecine, what might be characterized as internecine struggle. And the thing that pulled them together and united them to give them a sense of sameness was the attack. So here we say that the English, the French, the Spanish, the Italian, the Dutch, the German, the Danish, and Swedish, when they confronted with Africa, when they clashed with Africa, or what they call America and Asia, then the need arose for them to consider themselves as a set, a whole, different from, hostile to, and eventually superior to Africans, Americans, and Asian. Colonialism, it was colonialism that gave them a common interest. This is Jaffe. This common interest, the sense of sameness, common history, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. Elements contained in most definitions of the nation was forged through slavery and colonialism. This was the nation building process. The sense of sameness and common culture of violence are features of the subjective factors identifying the European nation. Contrary to white leftists and modern day Marxists, both the white ruling class and the white working class owe their existence to this process. They are historical twins containing the same DNA and spawned by a history of genocide and enslavement of other peoples that is repugnant in its entirety. The parasitic capitalist economy is the objective factor. The parasitic capitalist economy is the objective factor. So we spoke to the subjective content of this European nation. Now, the parasitic capitalist economy is the objective factor, the material base upon which the subjective relies. It is the bonding element of the nation that holds this collective community together. The European nation, and we do mean European, with its multiplicity of languages, classes, and internal borders, was born as a bourgeois nation, a white Christian nation, spawned through the blood and gore of slavery and colonialism, and resting on a foundation of capitalism benefiting Europe at the expense of Africans and the rest of the world. And sometimes, people say something is a bourgeois this and a bourgeois that, and it's more a pejorative than anything else. But what we're talking about now is that it is a nation that came into existence through capitalism, the rise of capitalism. It was a nation that was defined by the capitalist ruling class that's characterized as the bourgeoisie. It's the bourgeois nation. It's the nation of the bourgeoisie, of the capitalist ruling class. Aspects of the European nation's subjective content, its self-perception, were forged through the assault on Islam during the Christian Crusades in the feudal era for control of much of the same territory in North Africa and the Middle East that imperialism is contending for today. However, the most essential components of Europe's subjective identification grew out of its history of genocidal aggression against Africa that included colonial slavery. Herein lies the process that bonded Europe into a single nation, though differentiated by sometimes competing capitalist centers designated as countries and incorrectly identified as nations. This is like the anti-Islamic national, like the anti-Islamic national component, is residual from the pre-colonial European feudal era where contending European powers defined themselves primarily in relationship to each other, except for the United Looting Expedition through the Middle East that occurred under the religious banner of Christianity. Thus, the European nation was born white and Christian. Moreover, it was born as a bourgeois nation, as the center of capitalist production stemming from parasitic accumulation of capital flowing from colonial slavery. Thus, the European nation was born white and Christian. Moreover, it was born as a bourgeois nation at the center of capitalist production stemming from parasitic accumulation of capital flowing from colonial slavery. Even the European working class was born on the pedestal of colonialism and slavery, therefore ultimately realizing the benefit of an oppressor nation and identifying with its own bourgeoisie. So it was capitalism, it was the creation of capitalism on a foundation of slavery and colonialism that liberated the serfs and peasants of Europe during the feudal era. They were liberated as a consequence of colonialism. So enslaving Africans, stealing the lands and territories of the peoples of the Americas, Asia, and what have you, the Middle East, all of this led to the liberation of what we now characterize as the European working class. So you have this relationship. This is the dialectic that we're looking at. The rise of the European nation comes at the expense of the solidarity, the solidity, the unity of Africa and other peoples. So we say Marx was wrong. Feudalism preceded capitalism in Europe. Feudal society was defined primarily by the relationship between the nobility, impoverished peasants and serfs, agricultural workers who were tied to the estates of the feudal lords who expropriated most of what the serfs produced. While serfs could not be individually bought and sold, as was the case with Africans, the serf had little or no rights that were not granted by the lords. The role of the feudal state was to protect this relationship that required permanent attachment of the serf to the landed estates. And, we're talking about the state here and saying now we're talking about the feudal state. And of course, the state is that organ, this bureaucracy that controls and is attached to these instruments of coercion. The police, the army, all of the military, the prisons, the court system, et cetera. This is the state. And so under feudalism, we're saying that the serfs could not be individually bought and sold as was the state with Africans. The serfs had little or no rights that were not granted by the lords. The role of the feudal state was to protect this relationship that required permanent attachment of the serfs to the landed estates. That's what the feudal state was about. As we know, in describing the transformation of feudalism to capitalism, Karl Marx authored the term primitive accumulation, naming the European enslavement, genocide, wars, and occupation of oppressed peoples around the world as the source of the vast wealth extraction out of which the entire capitalist system was born. But Marx erroneously included in his definition of primitive accumulation the internal process of European peasants and serfs been driven from the land through England's Enclosure Acts beginning in the early 1600s that privatized lands that had been collectively farmed by peasants for centuries. According to Marx from part 8, volume 1 of Capital, quote, the economic structure of capitalist society was grown out of the economic structure of feudal society. The dissolution of the latter set free the elements of the former. The immediate producer, the laborer, could only dispose of his own person after he had ceased to be attached to the soil and ceased to be the slave, serf, or bondsman of another. To become a free seller of labor power, who carries his commodity wherever he finds a market, he must further have escaped from the regime of guilds, their rules for apprentices and journeymen, and the impediments of their labor regulation. Hence the historical movement which changes the producers into wage workers appears on the one hand as their emancipation from serfdom and from the fetters of the guilds, and this side alone exists for our bourgeois historians. But on the other hand, these new freedoms, freedmen became sellers of themselves only after they had been robbed of all their own means of production and all of the guarantees of existence afforded by the old feudal arrangement. And the history of this, their expropriation, is written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire. And so this is where Marx sees the critical struggle happening between the feudal peasants and serfs and the landlords, and the contest of capital coming into being through the expropriation of the lands and turning the serfs into quote unquote freed persons by making it necessary for them to go out and sell the value of their labor power. He says that to become a free seller of his labor power, who carries his commodity wherever he finds a market, and his commodity is his labor power. He must further have escaped from the regime of the guilds, their rules for apprentices and journeymen, and the impediments of their labor regulations. Hence the historical movement, which changes the producers into wage workers, appears on the one hand as their emancipation from serfdom and from the fetters of the guilds, and this side alone exists for our bourgeois historians. But on the other hand, these new freedmen become sellers of themselves only after they had been robbed of all their own means of production and all of the guarantees of existence afforded by the old feudal arrangements. And the history of this, their expropriation, is written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire. And so we talk about how this is the only thing, this movement that emancipated the serfs from the guilds and allowed them to become sellers of themselves. This is the only thing that's recognized by the bourgeois historians. But the point is, what is not recognized by Marx or the bourgeois historians, or certainly not sufficiently by Marx, not even as he talks about it some way, he minimizes it by introducing this question of the liberation or the emancipation of the serfs. This is the confusing thing for him. But the most significant factor is how Marx himself has undermined and the real most profound, most critical factor in the development of capitalism with this concept of the primitive accumulation of capital. He says all of this stuff, everything that he's talking about, the thing that made it important and necessary to liberate the serfs and peasants from the landed estates was colonialism. This is the thing that gave whole different kind of life injected into the feudal economy of Europe that transformed it. And so let's see more here. So Marx was wrong. Though this process involves the creation of the social mobility and capitalist labor force previously prohibited by feudalism, it is not primitive accumulation. That is to say, this thing that's happening between the peasants and the landlords. European capitalist society may have very well grown out of the economic structure of feudal society, as Marx said, but it was conceived by way of, quoting Marx again, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warring for the commercial hunting of black skins, unquote. Notably, in Capital, Marx devotes far more pages to the condition of peasants and serfs in the transformation from feudalism to capitalism than he does to the enslavement and genocide that created immense wealth for Europe, but destroyed the lives and means of production for millions and millions of African and oppressed peoples for centuries to come. Equating the removal of the European peasants from their land with the fact that Europe transformed Africa into what he characterized as a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins is a historical lie. It relegates African people to mere footnotes of history. The expulsion of the peasants from the land is a result of the process of primitive accumulation of capital, not a part of it. The expulsion of the peasants from the land is a result of the process of primitive accumulation of capital, not a part of it. Ultimately, the former serfs became European workers who now also sit on the pedestal of our oppression and benefit from it enormously. This Eurocentric error by Marx subordinates the historical basis of the existence of Africans and others to the requirements for European development. This Eurocentric error by Marx subordinates the historical basis of the existence of Africans and others to the requirement of European development. So we become forces whose existence is significant only in that it meets the requirements for European development. That's what the primitive accumulation of capital is. That's what even calling the development of capitalism, the starting point in development of capitalism, this primitive accumulation of capital that comes into feudalism that gives rise to capitalism. What is that primitive? It's slavery, it's colonialism, it's all the wars and attacks that Europe is making against the rest of us. So this is the thing that gives rise to capitalism and also to the European nation and identity. It objectifies the history and civilization of African people, rendering us invisible and leading to wrong conclusions that disguise the bloody reality of parasitism, making it seem that African people exist merely for the needs of Europeans. This political report is replete with examples that challenges Marx's confusion on this issue. When it comes to objectively describing the historical process that gave rise to capitalism and its impact on Europe and the development of capitalism, Jose Jaffe, quoted earlier in this chapter, and the African People's Socialist Party do a better job. Marx's lack of clarity obviously stems from his own social location on the pedestal of African slavery, a location that provided the superstructure for the European capitalist society within which Marx's consciousness was forged and that his life's work relentlessly criticized. In One People, One Party, One Destiny, the political report to our party's 5th Congress, we commented on the tendency by Marx to muddle this issue. Here's a selection, and we're quoting from the political report to the 5th Congress. We have to note here as well that Marx's description of slavery as an economic category and his concept of primitive accumulation provide outstanding examples of historic objectification of African people by Europeans. The entire historical process that resulted in the total disruption of the political economy of Africa, the imposition of colonial borders, and the capture and dispersal of millions of Africans whose forced labor was responsible for the development of Europe and European society is characterized as an economic category. Marx reduced the process of European pillage and plunder of the world and the ensuing genocide and enslavement to primitive accumulation of capital, a footnote whose function in history is to explain the development of Europe. In other words, Marx developed the concept of the fetish of the commodity to explain how commodity production for the market obscures and mystifies the relationship between people, allowing it to be confused with a relationship between things. A similar thing happened with the concept of primitive accumulation. Here, the relationship between peoples and countries is also obscured and mystified. Marx attributes European development solely to the genius and productive forces inside of Europe. He is thereby covering over or liquidating the origin of such development in the parasitic impairment of the capacity of independent development in Africa and other places victimized by Europe. There's a lot that can be said, about this, and this whole concept of the fetish of the commodity and how that is akin conceptually to what Marx has done with the primitive accumulation of capital. The fetish of the commodity simply means that production for trade and sale, which is commodity production, anything that's produced for sale or for the market, as they like to say, is a commodity. That's what a commodity is. It's not produced solely because somebody needs something. And sometimes commodity production will have the capitalists create the need in your brain so they can sell you something. It's commodity, it's trade. That's what commodity is for that. And so when you have commodity production, the relationship between the producer, the person who makes this thing, and the person who purchased this thing is obscure. When somebody goes to a store, furniture stores, and buys a table, the relationship that that person who buys the table has with the persons who made the table is obscure. That is gone. This is a commodity now. Whereas in the past, it would be true that somebody made a table and they would take the table to the market, and then somebody would come to the market with goats or chickens or something else, and they would trade. These individuals would trade. So you have a relationship between people. Now you don't have a relationship between people, you have a relationship between things. You go and you take some money into this marketplace and you pay for a table that the one who made the table is invisible, no longer exists. And people don't even know in many instances that milk comes from cows. You just go to the supermarket or you go to the grocery store if you live in one of the quote unquote developed capitalist countries, and you buy it. You don't see the cow, you don't see the person, the herder, you don't see the person who milked the cow or any of that. You just see the milk there. So you have this fetish of the commodity. Well, the same thing is true when you look at primitive accumulation. You go and buy an automobile, and you don't see the worker in the mines in Guyana or in West Africa who took the bauxite out to make the aluminum that went into the production of the bumpers and other things about the car. You don't see the Africans from Congo whose hands were cut off to make rubber on plantations for the Belgians so that there can be car tires. You don't see any of that. You just see something that happens in Europe. So this is something like the fetish of primitive accumulation. You are now obscuring or negating the relationship between peoples and that exists. I mean, the person who picks up that cabbage or that other vegetable in the supermarket in Florida doesn't see the Africans from Haiti who's been down in South Florida, or who has been in near state of slavery, who picked it. They don't see the Mexican who created that. So the relationship that that person has with that Mexican, that person has with that African who went out and got it, and sometimes in the process of getting it, caught all kinds of horrible diseases and were affected, like in some places living in caves and coming out just to pick this food. They don't see that. So the relationship that they have with these human beings, these people, is obscured. And so there's this concept of a primitive accumulation. It serves the same purpose as the commodification, as this whole fetish of the commodity. So we say that European nation is white and Christian. The European nation became the means of securing the loyalty of the emancipated laborers in the emergent capitalist state, and by association ruling class. Now, it is not the feudal state or sheriff from Nottingham that forces the toilers to fight the wars of the ruling class or put the interests of the state above their own. It is the flag, the national anthem, the Pledge of Allegiance, along with the collective identification with a common history, excuse me, that transcends. It is the flag, the national anthem, the Pledge of Allegiance, along with the collective identification with a common history that transcends individual European countries or territories. This is what facilitates the new relations of production necessary for capitalist production. Relations of production resting on a parasitic economic foundations whose genesis is colonial slavery. In summation, the European nation derives from relations of production contained within capitalism that was spawned by slavery and colonialism. It was born as a parasitic capitalist or bourgeois nation that encompasses all classes within it. The European sense of sameness, self-perception, and subjective expression necessary for binding the emergent working class to its newly forged bourgeoisie is white and Christian. The material basis of the European nation is the parasitic capitalist system that bore it in Europe. The capitalist system feeds the entire European nation through its cannibalistic parasitic relationship to Africa and most of the world. We have belabored this discussion and description of the European nation because its arrival on the world historical scene with the advent of capitalism has determined through the barrel of a gun how other national expressions would be defined by other peoples in various parts of the world. It is no accident that Europe would describe the nation in a manner that would not be applicable to Africans, the indigenous of the Americas, and many others whose enslavement was a condition for the emergence of the European or white nation in the first place. European scholars have demanded a common definition of the nation. It is a declaration of European universalism that requires every nation to contain the same elements apparent in the European nation. It is an extraordinary example of philosophical metaphysics to suggest that we should determine the quality of any social phenomenon without first examining the specifics and history of the phenomena being defined. It is an extraordinary example of imperialist national narcissism to define the validity of all social phenomenon based on proximity to one's own reality. The function of the European nation was to serve the development of Europe alone. The rise of the European nation was an attack on the development and survival of much of the world. So, yeah, this is an important discussion about that we've gone through in terms of the European nation, and how this sense of sameness, this self-perception and the subjective expression necessary for binding the emergent working class to its newly forged bourgeoisie is white and Christian. This came collectively together. The whole nation of Europe is comprised of all the social forces that are contained within it and who meet the other criteria of sense of sameness and unifying economy, common culture, that kind of thing. And that this was something that came about as a consequence of conquest and expropriation of value, culture, all kinds of things from Africa and other peoples. This is created the material development of Europe, came as a consequence of enslaving Africans, stealing the land of indigenous peoples throughout the Americas and other places, and transferring all this value. And all of the value was not material in the sense of gold and silver and other resources like that, but culture and things like that. So you had this process is what bound Europe, these people who were previously simply warring tribes in this land space we now know as Europe. This is what bound them together, gave them a subjective consciousness, and what defined them was their relationship to us. Now, this was the primary definition, which is not to say that the Irish and the British and the English and the French and the Germans, as they are characterized, don't have differences, and even some minor differentiations that they recognize. Sometimes it's characterized as language, but we see already from what we've read just how inconsequential the issue of language is. So we're not saying that some differences do not exist, but we're saying that all of Europe was consolidated in this process of slavery and colonialism. And while we say all of Europe, we may be more effectively saying all of Western Europe, but that's not an absolute truth, in the sense that most of Europe achieved a sense of identity based on this primary process that was going on, that was consolidating European capitalism through imperialist aggressions against the rest of us. So now let's look at the historical basis of the African nation state. Our discussion of the African nation and its definition, resting on a real material basis, must serve African development. Our discussion of the African nation and its definition, resting on a real material basis, must serve African development. The research, and that is to say, this is not some innocent discussion. This is not some pure abstract discussion. It has a relationship to materiality, to where we are, how we got here, and where we have to go if we're going to achieve happiness and free ourselves from material want, and what it's going to take to get us to that place. And this question of nation and nationality is fundamentally significant. And so even though I know that for some comrades, this might be a tiring and boring kind of discussion, it's really important for us to grapple with it, because we have to create working class intellectuals. Because most of the petty bourgeois forces who we know, who put themselves forward as some kind of revolutionary theoreticians, are simply imitators. It takes a minimal amount of courage to even think outside of the box that's been created by the bourgeoisie, to think something different, to assume authority and control and leadership over our own thought processes, defining our own reality for ourselves, assuming the responsibility for the liberation of Africa and African people on our own terms. That's the critical question that we're confronted with, and we have a responsibility. The African working class must have its own philosophy, and to say it has its own philosophy doesn't mean that it's unrelated to any other worldview or philosophy out there, but it must be a philosophy that stems from the requirements of history. The history is imposed upon us. I think it was Engels who said something like, freedom is the recognition of necessity. And we are saying that there are some things that are necessary for human society to exist. And of course, that is the ability to produce real life, to produce and reproduce life. And you can't produce and reproduce life for Africa as long as colonialism dominates Africa and African people. We produce and reproduce life for Europe and for all those other forces who've come in subsequently to eat at the trough, to suck the resources and blood from Africa and African people in the process of creating this social system that is parasitic to its core. Its very nature, every aspect of it is parasitic. So we have to define, take our worldview stems from, first of all, a historical materialist investigation of the advent, the rise of capitalism in the world, and its relationship to Africa and other oppressed peoples around the world. This is what African internationalism is. We use a historical materialist analysis to look at how capitalism came into existence. We say capitalism because that's the world economy, the dominant world economy, around which all of the activities that human beings are engaged in on the planet Earth revolve. Even as it means a part of the process of getting out of here, it's capitalism that we have to contend with. And capitalism was born as a world economy, as a world system through the slavery, the enslavement of African people and the colonization of the world in order to facilitate development and commodity production that came from the enslavement of African people. So our discussion on the African nation and its definition resting on a real material basis must serve African development. The research and writings of Cheikh Anta Diop demonstrate quite scientifically the cultural unity of Africa, going back through millennia. Diop authored the book, The Cultural Unity of Black Africa, the domains of patriarchy and of matriarchy in classical antiquity, that today remains the standard for investigation of ancient Africa by any serious historian. Below, we examine a quote extracted from Diop's otherwise deeply scientific work. Here, he not only explores the spiritual aspect of African identity, but he also compares it to that of Europe. This is because the discussion of characteristics specific to national identity always distinguishes one people or nation from an other. The nation cannot be defined by measuring itself against itself. If there is no other, there is no logic to the nation. The white man needed the existence of the Black man to achieve his identity. So it is with nations. The nation cannot be defined by measuring itself against itself. If there's no so-called other, there is no logic for the so-called nation. The so-called white man needed the existence of the so-called Black man to achieve his identity. So it is with nations. Of course, the problem for the European nation is that it resulted from a false, self-serving European definition of the African. Since this false definition was the basis upon which the sense of white sameness necessary for the definition of the European nation is anchored, the ability of the African to successfully achieve self-definition marks the beginning of the end of a crucial subjective factor necessary for European national coherence. I'm going to say this again. Of course, the problem for the European nation is that it resulted from a false, self-serving European definition of the African. Since this false definition was the basis upon which the sense of white sameness necessary for the definition of the European nation is anchored, the ability of the African to successfully achieve self-definition marks the beginning of the end of a crucial subjective factor necessary for European national coherence. So for European national coherence to maintain its coherence, to maintain its stability, then who they have defined the African to be must always be that. That is to say, their definition of the African must always suffice. If that's no longer the case, then who are they? This is a practical, real, profound contradiction that they have created by defining themselves in relationship to us. And they have defined us to their own requirements and needs, not based on some science. In fact, they covered science, they obscured science, they removed all evidence of who the hell we were and created this caricature of the African. And based on this caricature, the European nation itself has evolved, has come into existence. So we say Diop's workplace significance in what he characterized as a southern meridional cradle of human development versus the northern cradle. And how the differences in material conditions peculiar to each of them contributed to shaping the worldview and character of their respective inhabitants. This is Diop's summation that contributes to defining the national character of African people as compared to Europeans. Quote, we're quoting Diop now. In conclusion, the meridional cradle, confined to the African continent in particular, is characterized by the matriarchal family, the creation of the territorial state in contrast to the Aryan city state. In conclusion, the meridional cradle, confined to the African continent in particular, is characterized by the matriarchal family, the creation of the territorial state, in contrast to the Aryan city state, the emancipation of women in domestic life, xenophilia, cosmopolitanism, a sort of social collectivism having as a corollary a tranquility, going as far as unconcerned for tomorrow, a material solidarity of right for each individual, which makes moral or material misery unknown to the present day. There are people living in poverty, but no one feels alone and no one is in distress. In the moral domain, it shows an ideal of peace, of justice, of goodness, and an optimism which eliminates all notion of guilt or original sin in religion, in religious and metaphysical institutions. The northern cradle, confined to Greece and Rome, is characterized by a patriarchal family, by the city-state. It is easily seen that it is on contact with the southern world that the northerners broaden their conception of the state, elevating themselves to the idea of elevating themselves to the idea of a territorial state and of an empire. The particular character of these city-states, outside of which a man was an outlaw, developed an internal patriotism as well as xenophobia. Individualism, moral and material solitude, a disgust for existence, all the subject matter of modern literature, which even in its philosophical aspect is none other than the expression of the tragedy of a way of life going back to the Aryan ancestors, are all attributes to this cradle, an ideal of war, violence, crime, and conquest inherited from nomadic life, with as a consequence a feeling of guilt and of original sin, which causes pessimistic religious and metaphysical systems to be built as the special attributes of this cradle, unquote. However, notwithstanding the usefulness of the works of Diop and similar scholars, all of which had to battle against hundreds of years of European prejudice disguised as scholarship to reach the day of light, the light of day, our discussion of the African nation will revolve around the same time period to which the birth of the European nation belongs. It is clear from what has already been revealed in this political report that there's a direct causal relationship between the existence of the European nation and the aspirations of Africans to consolidate the African nation. Like the European nation, The emergent African nation is a response to necessity. We are facing the historical requirements for advancing and developing Africa and African people, whose generally oppressive conditions of existence derive from the stuff resulting in the emergence of the European or white bourgeois or capitalist nation. One people, one party, one destiny address this necessity. It raises the issue of the consolidation of the African nation as a practical political problem that we must solve to forward the national liberation of our people from imperialist domination worldwide. African internationalism is a theory of practice as exemplified by this passage. Quote, this is from One People, One Party, One Destiny, the political report to the 5th Congress of our party. We're quoting this. An African internationalist investigation leads us to conclude, among other things, that key to the liberation of African people is the defeat of the parasitic stranglehold that has been imposed on us by imperialism. Moreover, as African internationalists, we recognize that Africa has been under some kind of attack for millennia, but that our struggle today is contextualized by the fact that the world economy that gives life to our oppression is a capitalist economy. Our struggle is not fueled by a subjective need for vengeance against every group that has historically attacked Africa. This means that the struggle must be waged against the capitalist social system that is the basis of our exploitation and wretched conditions of existence today. Our struggle for the unification and emancipation of our Africa and our people is also a struggle against capitalism. Hence, our struggle, if it's to be fought to a successful conclusion, must be led by the African working class. It must result in the establishment of a united socialist Africa responsive to the needs of African people worldwide. African internationalism teaches us that slavery, colonialism, and neo-colonialism, along with African disunification and dispersal, provided the material basis for the European bourgeois national consolidation, the sense of white sameness resting on the pedestal of the oppression of African and colonized peoples. Hence, we understand that a key function of the revolutionary struggle for the permanent defeat of imperialism and to liberate Africa and her scattered children is the reunification of African people worldwide into a revolutionary proletarian nation. That's a key function of the revolution. It is slavery, and quoting Marx, that gave the colonists their value. It is the colonists that created world trade, and it is world trade that is the precondition for a large-scale industry. These words by Marx recognize the role of plunder of Africa in the establishment of capitalism and carry within them the suggestion of what it would take to destroy the capitalist world economy. The African who gave value to the colonies is now the oppressed and exploited inhabitants of the colonies that are sometimes incorrectly referred to as nations. Our conditions of existence in the colonies and elsewhere in the world of imperialist created borders centered in and derived from the conditions of existence in Africa that are the consequence of the primitive accumulation of capital, the original sin. Our conditions of existence in the colonies and elsewhere in this world of imperialist created borders are centered in and derived from the conditions of existence in Africa that are the consequence of the primitive accumulation of capital, the original sin. In other words, the hell that we catch in St. Petersburg, Florida, the hell that we catch in Johannesburg, the hell that we catch in Milwaukee and various other places in the world, the Bahamas, etc., is something that has its origin in the attack on Africa and the dispersal of African people around the world. The same process, the same system captured our Africa, controls our Africa today, and then dispersed us around the world, gave us new names, created a new false history for us, etc. That's the thing that we're up against, and that's what we must recognize. Our history didn't begin in Mississippi, and it certainly didn't begin in England and what have you. Our struggle didn't begin there. Our struggle began with the assault on Africa. And we have taken the consequence of that attack on Africa every place we have gone. We are suffering as a people all around the world, and the origin of that suffering is the initial attack on Africa that captured Africa, captured Africans, dispersed us around the world, and now control Africa and all the resources that Black people need in order to produce life for ourselves. So our conditions of existence in the colonies and elsewhere in this world of imperialist created borders are centered in and derived from the conditions of existence in Africa that are the consequences of the primitive accumulation of capital, the original sin, as Marx characterized it. Our revolutionary struggle for liberation, unification, and socialism in Africa, throughout the colonies and other areas of the world to which we have been forcibly dispersed in the construction of capitalism, will prove to be as significant in the defeat of capitalist social system as the slave trade was in its advent. The socialist liberation and unification of Africa and African people under the leadership of the African working class will be the central factor in the defeat of world capitalism, will provide the material basis for the advent of world socialism. The socialist liberation and unification of Africa and African people under the leadership of the African working class will be the central factor in the defeat of world capitalism and will provide the material basis for the advent of world socialism. African internationalism, which demands the total revolutionary liberation and unification of Africa and African people worldwide under the leadership of the African working class, is informed by this scientifically sound dialectic. Hence, the African internationalist struggle for the liberation and unification of Africa and African people is at the same time the key factor in the achievement of socialism as a world economy. It is the way forward for those Marxists and other socialists who are confronted with a false conundrum surrounding the question of socialism in one country. As capitalism was born as a world economy, with its basis in the enslavement and dispersal of African people, leading to, as Marx wrote, considerable masses of capital and labor power in the hands of producers. So too will socialism be born as a world economy in the process of reversing the verdict of imperialism. Hence, socialism will not be born in one country, but in many countries that are tied to the defining economy of a liberated and united Africa and people under the revolutionary leadership of the African working class. This is why a fundamental task of the African revolutionary is the consolidation of the proletarian African nation. That's a fundamental task of the African revolutionary, is consolidation of the proletarian African nation, unquote. The African petty bourgeoisie attacks Garvey and the nation. I'm on page 343. This was not the extent of our discussion of the nation in the political report to our Fifth Congress. Then as now, we were engaging in serious struggle with the ossified notions that have hampered and misdirected our struggle since the political defeat of the Universal Negro Improvement Association led by Marcus Garvey in the 1920s. That struggle is still happening, by the way. There are African intellectuals who today like to think of themselves as progressives and Black leftists and things like that, who carry on the same struggle against Garvey. They hold up W.E.B. Du Bois on one instance, or they say both of them were cool, etc. But they continue to make that we are still engaged in that struggle. We are engaged in struggle with opportunists, people who have this extraordinary relationship with imperialist white power, who don't want to not be Americans, who don't want to not be French, who don't want to not be Swedish, who have been captured ideologically by the bourgeoisie, by the international capital, international imperialists. I mentioned earlier the presentation that I made at Oxford, the so-called debate. There were on both sides of the question about closer unity, whether closer unity within Africa was desirable. And there were three of us who were on each side of the question. And one guy who was on the same side, supposedly as I, he had been a former US ambassador to the Organization of African Unity. And he opened up his presentation after I spoke about one Africa, one nation, and the falsity of the notion of the Black Brit and the Afro-American, et cetera. And he opened up his presentation, and he's on my side, with the statement that he was a proud African-American and an Anglophile. He was also a graduate of Oxford University. But I just found it extraordinary. I've never heard anybody, I mean, I've heard proud Afro-American and African-Americans, but an Anglophile on top of it. So that was a hell of a statement. So now we are on page 343, and I think the director wants me to close it down so that we can move forward with this discussion. And so let's do that. And let me turn it over now to Comrade Director Akile Anai Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman. Uhuru. I mean, it's such a great study, and yeah, I hate to have to shut it down, but we do have people in the comments who, so far we have about 2 questions, and just, you know, people are really engaged. And one person commented, I think you mentioned or referred to as this particular type of studying boring, and they said boring, no way, you know. So people are really excited about this discussion, and I want to go ahead and first acknowledge where people are watching from. We have viewers in St. Petersburg, Florida, Kuwait, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Huntsville, Alabama, Chicago, Illinois, Brooklyn, New York, St. Louis, Missouri, Compton, California, Frankfurt, Germany, Occupied Azania, Lawrenceville, Georgia, Hempstead, New York, Minneapolis, Minnesota, San Diego, California, Tampa, Florida, London, Sierra Leone, Pinellas Park, Florida, Fort Myers, Florida, Nigeria, and Los Angeles, California. We also had acknowledgements from Comrade Benjamin Prado from Unión do Barrio, says Uhuru, comrades, and the Secretary General for the African Socialists International, Luizy Kinshasa, also says Uhuru, Chairman. So I wanted to acknowledge those viewers and go ahead and get into one of our first questions that came in from Comrade Santosh. Towards the beginning of this study, asked, Uhuru, Chairman, I wanted to get your thoughts on Beirut and the news coverage that Lebanon wants France to take over after Macron's visit to the blast site.
That's not even unusual to see that happen. We've seen Africa's on the continent of Africa, in South Africa, conditions get so damn bad under this neo-colonial regime that the African colonized calls for the colonizer to come back in. But I've also recognized that it's typical kind of imperialist tactics and strategy. We've seen this happen before, where they will create a problem, an incident that creates a tremendous amount of instability and problems for the people, and present themselves as the only ones who can solve the problem. The fact is that the way Lebanon has been under assault since its creation, in this modern creation, has been something that was to make sure that Europe continued to control that territory and all the resources in that territory. And there's an ongoing struggle that's been going on. The United States playing a primary role, along with the illegitimate white nationalist settler state of Israel, to destabilize Lebanon, particularly because of the role of Hezbollah, which has kicked Israel's ass on every attempt that it has come in to attack, you know, Lebanon. It wants to dominate and control the world, and there's an assumption of Hezbollah and some and indirectly Iran having authority, some authority there in Lebanon, just as there's an assumption that Iran's influence has now extends into Yemen. And in both of these places, every place you see that the European and white settler colonial state of Israel are attacking the people. And if the people are not aware of the source of the attacks, the contradictions, and the objective is to get the people to call for the white man to come back in and to provide stability. And so I would not be surprised if that's what it is that we're looking at today, right now, in Lebanon. There's no doubt in my mind that the United States government, that the illegitimate white nationalist settler state of Israel, a cancer, on the body of the whole, what is characterized as the Middle East. There's no doubt in my mind that they played a role in this process, and perhaps even France, because France played a role in what would be called the creation of Lebanon. England and France in particular drew those borders and what have you to serve their interests. And the people have not even become accustomed yet to running their own affairs, and it's hard to become accustomed because the imperialist powers control the economy and therefore have been ultimately able to say who is going to be in power, and when who they want in power is not in power, if that's challenged, then they do everything to wreck the economy, to wreck the society, so that the people would turn back to the colonizer if they could for some kind of relief from the terror that they're experiencing. And terror is real. That bombing was real. It was a horrendous bombing that happened in Lebanon, and it would be completely out of character if Israel and the United States and possibly France didn't have something to do with it. There's no doubt in my mind that they had something to do with it. Uhuru.
Thank you, Chairman. This next question comes from Wanda Ann, located in Winter Park, Florida. This person actually asked a question last week and it wasn't able to get answered. So they ask, how do we get our problems in the diaspora listened to by the World Court / United Nations? Is there negotiation with an African country to give us citizenship without living there? Since we are technically, but no one is doing it, so we can be a people with a nationality and not a color. That was the full question, I guess, / comment.
Well, first of all, we are people with a nationality, and claiming it is the critical aspect of consolidating that nationality. You're claiming it from wherever you are in Florida, just as we have to claim it, and the comrades do claim it in what they call South Africa. And they call for death to South Africa, free Africa. And because South Africa itself is a creature of the colonial borders, and every place, the so-called free countries that you're talking about are themselves creatures of imperialism, colonialism. The white man sat at a table and drew them up and said, this is who you are. And if you don't, and they drew the borders. And at that time, when they drew the borders, we weren't to have any influence. And the only reason they had to act like we had some influence because the revolutionary struggles throughout Africa was screaming, kill the white man. And so the white man disguised himself and put white power in black faces in these neo-colonial territories. And so all of it, virtually every inch of the 12,000 square miles of Africa is under foreign colonial domination. Sometimes it's indirect, so that it's not obvious to many peoples around the world. So our struggle that really consolidates the African nation is not simply by going to a colonized place in Africa, but uniting with the process to liberate all of Africa as one, which is what the African People's Socialist Party and the African Socialist International are about. That's what African internationalism is. It recognizes that we are one African people who have been separated at gunpoint by foreigners and aliens, people who hate our guts and want to steal all of our resources. And they foment hatred within the social systems that they have created to control and dominate us. They foment hatred against us. They create a false narrative that defines us as inferior, et cetera. The way we get out of that is not by, and by the way, I guess you have to live in Ghana. Maybe you do, I don't know. Ghana is offering up, the tourist department of Ghana has offered to open up the lucrative thing of you can get dual citizenship now. The same ones who overthrew Nkrumah, who was trying to unite all of Africa, now they're saying that you can get dual citizenship because that's an economic boom they see for Ghana. But the way that we get out of this is uniting in this revolutionary project. There is no way out of our circumstances short of revolution. We're gonna have to take back our freedom, our Africa, all of Africa. There's not any place in Africa that is not dominated in some way or another, directly or indirectly, by white power. And increasingly, of course, white power has a contender that looks like China, that speaks Chinese and what have you. And there are other forces who are rushing in as the European colonial powers seem to be weakening. Other forces are rushing in to try and take its place and try to take up some space at the trial, eating the flesh of Africa and African people. You have to fight for Africa. That's what we're doing. That's what this study, that's what this discussion is all about. Jump on board. Uhuru.
Uhuru. And you can jump on board at apspuhuru.org. And we have about, well, okay, so we'll take this next question and we'll see what we're looking like with time. But this comes from Agbe in Frankfurt, Germany, says there is a rumor that President Trump, US President Donald Trump, might refuse to step down and using the military to remove him. Can you please explain how he himself is the chief of the military and the three pillars of the US government?
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge, let me get back to that. I want to just give a shout out to the comrades in Ghana, party forces in Ghana, and party forces in Uganda, these and Sierra Leone, where we really struggling now to pull everything back together in the best possible way. And also, of course, these incredible comrades who in occupied Tanzania called South Africa. I just wanted to do that. I think it's really important because these forces and sometimes not isolation, but the infrastructure is so poor in some of these places that is communication is not as adequate as we would like for it to be. But in terms of the question that was raised, what was the question raised by the comrade about how the Trump not step in the fable about the three pillars of U.S. government? And I say it's a fable in the sense that while there is a formal arrangement that presupposes checks and balances by the judiciary, executive, and the legislative branches, the fact is imperialism controls all of it. And every person who runs for office on the local, federal level, and everyone who runs office to be head of the executive branch, they are representing some sector of the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie has hired them, paid for them for most part. There are a few exceptions. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, they work for the bourgeoisie. They don't work for the people who they claim to be working for. And that's why you see this whole marriage. People are scared. You say, well, what happens if Trump refuses to step down? Well, you got the three branches of the government, they say. So then the court can say, step down, Trump. But Trump appointed the damn court. And whether Trump appointed them or not, the fact is that the US government has generally come to accept the overarching leadership of the executive branch of the government. That's why constitutionally, a president should not be able to declare war on his own. But the fact is, presidents do it. And the US Supreme Court, generally speaking, backs them up when they do that. They come up with, they give it a different characterization, a different name to do the same thing, like declaring war on people. So the fact is that this system is on a particular trajectory all the time, and it's in a state of severe crisis right now. The reason this question about Trump stepping down is even on the table is testimony to the crisis of the social system, and it's acting crazy. I mean, you see Trump comes to power, he's formerly the head of the military. He's been struggling to assure that he's head of the military since he came into office. He's put generals in charge and he's had to fire them because the generals in many instances who he's put in places of responsibility in his government have been tied to other sectors of the white ruling class, and they were not reliable. They were carrying out the programs and objectives of other sectors of the white ruling class. So there is a serious kind of crisis that's being experienced by the whole social system. And it is something that is made manifest by what they call the inability of the Congress to come to any decisions. They can't come to any kind of conclusion. This is crisis. You got the three branches of government, but none of them can get anything done. Logjam. The Congress is logjam. They can't even come up with imperialist economic salvation by giving the people money to give to the corporations to keep the corporations to keep the economy running. Of course, they give the corporations money too, just in case, much more money, but this is a consumer-based society. So they need people to be able to pay rent. They need people to be able to buy cars. They need people to be able to do all these other kinds of things. If they can't work, then they can't do those things. And that's a severe crisis. The bourgeoisie, everything gets lost. It foments revolutionary struggle, resistance among the people, etc. This is not a good thing for the social system. They're not doing what they want to do. They're doing what history, the struggles of the people are forcing them to do right now. And there's no telling what the outcome of this is going to be. Of course, we know what we want it to be. That's why we're having this discussion right now. Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you, Chairman. And we have maybe just a few more minutes. I don't know if you wanted to just give us some closing remarks before we get into our announcement.
Is there anything else that might be spoken to?
I didn't see any other questions following that one. I do want to recognize that we have viewers. Some people wanted to shout out their location. So Bermuda and Lakeland, Florida.
Uhuru, wanted to shout out, give special comrade to comrade in Bermuda for the work that you're doing. Keep on doing it, brother. And let's build a party there and throughout the Caribbean. And in Lakeland, I got a hunch that might be somebody I know too. So Uhuru, comrade, glad to see you here participating in this study. And I just want to say, comrades, that it's really important for us to take quite seriously what it is that we do. Study is a really important aspect of revolutionary work, and it should be considered that way. It's not a substitute for revolutionary work. It's a part of the work that we do. Practice is primary, but we really have to study, and we have to come to grips with all of these ideas. We are now in the process of preparing ourselves to govern, and we have to really believe in that. The African nation is going to be liberated, and all of our forces scattered around the African world. And hoping that some of the people in various places in Nigeria, I think we are in the process of building in Nigeria as well, recognize that we are part of the process of consolidating the African nation and the capacity for an all-African national government. That's what we're working for. Our intention is to have power, because it doesn't even make any sense to do this stuff if we're not engaged in the process of acquiring power. So please recognize the significance of these discussions and studies that we're involved in. Don't be confused by a lot of nonsense. Even a lot of people walking around with guns and stuff is not a substitute for understanding the science of revolution, the science and art of revolution. And people in Sierra Leone know what I'm talking about, because we went through a horrible situation in Sierra Leone where people claiming to be revolutionaries and held up their affinity for the gun as the example of what revolutionary is supposed to be. And a lot of people were murdered in that process. So we know something about the social system, and that's what it is that we're talking about on today, the social system itself. You know the system, you're part of bringing it down. The gun is only probably one of them, in this circumstances, one of the more, it will be something that becomes less significant than all of the other work that we have to do to deepen this crisis of the social system itself. So I want to thank everybody for being here, and Comrade Akile, the incredible job that you do. And I want people to recognize and be prepared to get the latest issue of The Burning Spear newspaper that you got out, Comrade Sister Akile. And also people should buy the book, Vanguard. And there are people, I'm told, during this pandemic, people are locked up and that time, and they want to, during the uprising, they want to learn something about Black people and Black history. But this is no Black history thing, you know, so you can be able to have great debates, you know, with your classmates and what have you. But you should buy Vanguard. And Comrade Akile is probably going to tell you how to get Vanguard so you can study the revolution and engage, and how to be engaged in practice to make the revolution. Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you, Chairman. Thank you for those plugs. And yeah, we will be talking a little bit more about that in just a moment. So I just wanted to say, because of time, I want everyone to know that if your question was not answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you and make sure that the Chairman sees your question. This study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, Winning the War of Ideas. For your revolutionary news and analysis, you can visit theburningspear.com and join us for the entire month as we celebrate Black August, a month of African resistance. During Black August, the Burning Spear newspaper conducts an annual fundraiser to keep the spear burning. The Revolutionary Black Power print and online journal in constant production since 1968 Help us reach our fundraising goal by donating at theburningspear.com/Black-August. Contribute to the Mafundi Lake Sponsor of Prisoner Fund, where we ship to over 500 prisoners for free. Participate in our August spear sales competition and win some one-of-a-kind collector's items. And tune in August 28th at 7 p.m. Eastern for a virtual cultural event, Africa Speaks for Itself, a night of poetry and storytelling with African cultural workers across the world, celebrating 100 years since the adoption of the red, black, and green flag to represent the African nation by Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. And this event will also have our very own Chairman Omali Yeshitela with us. So make sure you look at and go to burningspear.com/Black-August to look at all the details regarding everything we'll be doing for Black August, including that event. For Revolutionary Radio, dynamic shows and music by Africans all around the world. Tune into Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via our Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. Did you unite with what you heard today and want to learn more about how you can get involved with the African People's Socialist Party? You can visit apspuhuru.org for all information regarding how you can apply, and order your copy of Chairman Omali Yeshitela's latest book, Vanguard, the Advanced Attachment of the African Revolution, the piece we were reading today. You can order that at burningspearmarketplace.com, and other revolutionary readings that the chairman, typically reads from, things that he quoted from today, at burningspearmarketplace.com. Coming up August 15th and 16th, the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations is virtually hosting their annual conference themed Fight for Black Power, Free All Political Prisoners. The Fight for Black Power requires the immediate release of all our political prisoners, and you can register today at blackisbackcoalition.org. We're calling on people to follow the All African Peoples Development and Empowerment Project on Facebook, or visit developmentforafrica.org for important information and helpful tips in regards to COVID-19. AFDEP has recently launched an international telehealth program, a free resource for African people to get our COVID-19 related questions and concerns answered by licensed doctors and nurses through Project Black Onc. You can make your free virtual appointment with one of their professional health providers by going to developmentforafrica.org/telehealth. Uhuru Furniture Stores in Oakland and Philadelphia go live on Facebook every week to highlight beautiful new pieces and build African economic self-determination. In Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, tune in every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time at facebook.com/Uhuru Furniture Philly. In Oakland, California, you can tune in every Wednesday and Saturday at 12 p.m. Pacific Time at facebook.com/Uhuru Furniture Oak. I also want to say that if you didn't get enough from the Omali Taught Me Sunday studies, that the chairman does go live every week on Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Eastern with his address to the African nation, live from his page, Chairman Omali Yeshitela, and the Burning Spear TV on YouTube, where he discusses some of the current events and gives them an African internationalist analysis. So you don't just have to wait one day a week for Omali Taught Me Sunday study. You can tune in to Chairman's address to the African nation. Again, that's every Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on the Chairman Omali Yeshitela Facebook page and Burning Spear TV YouTube. And lastly, to keep up with our movement events, visit theburningspear.com's events page and subscribe to our mailing list. Thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. Uhuru.